Miller, and the title of his presentation is Understanding and Ameliorating, boy, that's a hard word to say, the physical health problems associated with early life adversity. Dr. Miller.
Thanks a lot for having me. It's great to be here. Let's see. I'm going to put this on my lapel so I can wander. Can you hear me okay? All right. So I am happy to make this as interactive as you would like. So don't hesitate to interrupt me with questions, whether they be clarifications or just bigger picture questions. I think if it's a dialogue, it'll probably be more interesting for everybody. And I've got 45 minutes worth of material or so. I'm not committed to getting all the way through it. So jump in when you're moved to, and let's talk. I'm really grateful for the invitation to be here, and very excited to tell you about some of the research we've been doing and get your reactions and learn more about what you all are doing. As the title suggests, the type of research we do is trying to understand childhood experiences and what impact they have on physical health across the life course. So researchers and clinicians and policymakers have known for decades and decades that kids who grow up in challenging circumstances have worse life outcomes on average in a variety of domains. Most of the research historically that's been done on kids exposed to adversity has focused on how they do in school, what kind of jobs they get, what kind of labor market outcomes they get, mental health problems, encounters with the criminal justice system. And that's pretty much a done deal. That research has established, of course, on average, that kids who grow up in challenging circumstances, on average, have worse outcomes across those domains. What's been, I think, more recent and more surprising is research in the last decade or so showing that early childhood adversity not only relates to labor market outcomes and mental health outcomes, but to also physical health outcomes, and physical health outcomes that don't just occur in childhood, but occur much later in life. And Felidi's work that was discussed earlier this morning on adverse childhood experiences is part of that story. There's a bunch of parallel literatures that suggest similar things with different exposures around poverty, child maltreatment, and we'll talk some about that today, what we know and what we don't know. So let me just show you a few examples of the kinds of associations with physical health outcomes that we're going to discuss today. Did anybody have a pointer? Or the IT guy was going to... Apparently laser pointers don't work because it's a transparent screen, so it'll go right through it. So I might need an old-fashioned stick or something. Let's see. I might be able to use the cursor. Does that work? Nope, it doesn't work. All right. Well, we'll just use my hand if I can. So this is a study that I think exemplifies the patterns that have been seen in the literature over the past decade or so. So this is a longitudinal study that followed about 5,000 people in Britain who were born in the years after World War II. And they were followed prospectively for over half a century. And at the end of the study, the researchers did something very crude, which is to divide the respondents in the study into categories based on their childhood socioeconomic status. And that was very simply categorized as whether their father had a manual versus non-manual occupation. So this is a very crude measure of childhood socioeconomic status. But despite how crude it is, you can see that groups who had higher and lower socioeconomic status in childhood had different patterns of survival across early to middle adulthood, and that by the time the sample got to their mid-50s, there was a substantial difference in premature mortality favoring those who came from families where the father had a non-manual occupation. And this curve is adjusted for lots of other factors that are associated with premature mortality. So age, gender, racial and ethnic identity, what their educational achievement was as an adult, what their income was as an adult, whether they smoked, what their body mass index is. So apart from all those things that usually forecast premature mortality, childhood socioeconomic conditions above and beyond told us something about whether people were going to die in their early 50s. Now, you might say, all right, these curves suggest that 94% of the people who came from low socioeconomic status family were alive versus 97% from a high socioeconomic status family. This is, sure, it's a difference of 3% in premature mortality, but still almost everybody's living here, right? So this is just a small example. But if you go and do the study where you follow people out past their mid-50s, when mortality is relatively uncommon, into their 70s or 80s or 90s, when mortality rates pick up, these curves remain at about the same level of distance from one another. So there's about a 1.5 to 2-fold difference in mortality risk according to childhood socioeconomic status above and beyond other things that predict mortality. So there are a couple dozen studies that show similar things. If you look at outcomes that are a little bit different from whether people die, like do they get sick, you see similar patterns. So you see that childhood socioeconomic status forecasts to some extent people's risk for having first heart attacks, first strokes, getting diabetes, autoimmune conditions. There's a variety of different chronic health problems that are associated with early life socioeconomic adversity. This is a nice study of vulnerability to respiratory infections. So this is a paradigm that was developed by Sheldon Cohen at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, who is my postdoc advisor, and he's got this one-of-a-kind way to study things. So he takes volunteers, they're mainly college students and young adults, and he checks them into the local Holiday Inn for about a week. And on the first day there, they get a nasal exam to make sure that they're free of respiratory infections. And on the second day, he shoots them up the nose with viruses that cause them to get sick, either the flu or the common cold. And they stay in the Holiday Inn for the rest of the week. Everybody gets their own room to make sure people don't spread the virus. And it turns out that in these studies, about 50% of the people who get the virus actually get sick, and 50% don't. And you define sickness according to how much mucus they produce, whether they have a fever, whether they have a runny nose, whether they self-report symptoms. And he can predict, to some degree, who's going to get sick after the viral challenge based on characteristics of those people's social relationships, based on their socioeconomic status, based on their mood, and also based on their childhood socioeconomic circumstances. So I'm going the wrong direction here. Apologies. So these are, again, some crude data where these are adults, average age about 30, and he's looking back at their childhood socioeconomic status and categorizing it based on how many years during their childhood they lived in a home that was owned by the family as opposed to rented by the family. And you can see they're just split into tertiles for convenience sake here, and you can see that there's a dose-response relationship in terms of people's adult risk for getting a cold based on their childhood social circumstances. So this looks at how many people got infected. By infected, I mean that they got the virus and the virus replicated, and you could find higher amounts of the virus in the body after the challenge than you found before. But not everybody who has viral replication shows symptoms, right? So the virus might take off in your body, but you may not get a runny nose, you may not get a fever. So this looks at, of the people who got infected, where the virus replicated, showed signs of clinical illness. And you can see, regardless of how you dice it, there's a dose-response relationship. The better your childhood socioeconomic circumstances, as reflected by more years of family home ownership, the more likely, or the less likely you were to get sick 20, 30 years later after this viral challenge. And again, this is after adjusting for contemporaneous socioeconomic status, so adjusting for the education these people obtained during their life course. Again, this isn't the only thing that affects their risk for colds. There are lots of other things, but there's increasing evidence that childhood socioeconomic conditions can tell us something about people's subsequent health risks. And there's now evidence suggesting that as we heard in the first set of lectures that these effects may not just be contained to one generation. They might actually spill over into the next. These are some findings that we published this year based on a cohort of about 750 pregnant women. We found that if you looked at the degree of economic hardship that pregnant women had when they were children, adjusting for their own current socioeconomic status, that their own childhood hardship was associated with their likelihood of delivering preterm, their own babies, at 37 weeks or less, and their likelihood of having a baby who was small for gestational age, so that would be 10th percentile birth weight corrected for age and sex of the baby. Again, so this is saying that women who were pregnant and in their own childhood had a lot of socioeconomic disadvantage, so as typified by receiving government assistance, an income below the poverty level, their parents had less than a high school education, their parents had troubles with employment and underemployment. Those women were more likely to deliver early, to deliver babies who were small for gestational age. And again, that's above and beyond how much education and income the women themselves had. So there seems to be something about socioeconomic disadvantage in childhood, in the first 10 or 15 years of life, that stays with people health-wise. And it's a really intriguing, if disturbing phenomenon. I study socioeconomic status mostly as the kind of early life exposure that is associated with health. But that's not to say there aren't other early life adversities that are relevant, or that socioeconomic status doesn't feed into some of the family and individual level exposures that have been studied in the literature. For example, here's some work that we did on childhood abuse using that MIDAS cohort that came up in the panel discussion. So in these analyses of MIDAS, we focused on about 7,000 people in that survey who gave reports retrospectively of whether they'd been exposed to moderate or severe physical abuse during childhood and emotional abuse. And then we followed them for about 25 years to look at mortality rates. And you can see here that there are clear differences in mortality as a function of retrospective reports of childhood abuse. So people who reported an experience of severe childhood abuse were about 1.5 times, again, more likely to die over the 20-year follow-up period versus people who didn't, and that's adjusting again for traditional predictors of mortality. And then if you look at how many different kinds of abuse people reported having experienced, emotional versus moderate versus severe physical, there's this dose-response relationship with later mortality, as you'd expect. So respondents who reported experiencing all these kinds of abuse were more likely to die over the 20-year follow-up than those who reported experiencing some, who were in turn more likely to die than those who reported none. So there are now multiple studies looking at maltreatment, abuse, socioeconomic status as the main sorts of childhood adversities that relate to lifelong health. So why should we care about all this? I think this is in an audience where I have to persuade you that this is important, but let me just take a minute. So obviously these findings have a lot of implications and importance for families and for individuals. They have implications for public health, right? So if we know that childhood experiences relate to common chronic diseases of aging, things like heart disease, cancers, premature mortality, that has implications for our public health system, for the funding of our public health system, for our medical system, and also implications for the labor market. If people are getting sick sooner or dying sooner as a function of childhood adversity, then that's going to have implications for human capital availability and the economy. If these findings are causal, that is, if early life adversity is kicking off some chain of events that culminates in people being more likely to get sick when they're older or more likely to die, and I'm not saying this is necessarily causal, but just indulge the thought for a second that it is causal, then we're going to be seeing the effects of what's going on today for a while, right? So if people right now, kids who are in middle childhood, are experiencing those adversities, and they're more likely to have heart attacks and strokes when they get to their 50s or 60s, we're going to be seeing the repercussions of today's social and economic policies and family climates in 2060, 2070, a long time to come. We don't tend to think that much forward in our policy making, unfortunately. The findings also raise really challenging questions. I think when you see these relationships between early adversity and later health, it gets you thinking about, wow, that has important but really difficult to conceive of implications for how we think about the problem research-wise, what we do in terms of practice, and what we do in terms of policy. So the first question that as a researcher you want to ask is, how is it that low socioeconomic status or other kinds of early adversity get under the skin? How is it that you take something like being low income or having maltreatment and get it into the cells that make up the heart, that make up the lungs, that make up tumors? How do you bridge that divide between the sort of intangible psychosocial experience of adversity and the very tangible experience of having your arteries plugged up or a tumor growing in your body? So those mind-body effects take some real thinking and some real progress to kind of unravel. And I know you've had speakers in the past couple of years like Bruce McEwen who have spent their careers trying to answer those questions, and they've given us some real insights about how it might work. Then there's this thing that we think of as the incubation problem. So a lot of the connections that the slides I've shown have drawn are between exposures in childhood and health outcomes that happen presumably 50, 60, 70 years later. Most of the work that's been done on how stress and different kinds of adversity affect physiology in the body focuses on the here and now. So we know a lot about what's happening to my HPA axis and my autonomic nervous system as I stand up here giving a talk, right? We've got thousands of studies that really, in a meticulous way, take apart the physiology of stress as it's in the here and now. That's pretty easy to do. We can put college students up in front of us giving impromptu public speeches where they're told there are judges watching your speech and the judges are scowling or indifferent, and that makes people anxious, and we can take that apart exquisitely. But we know really, really little about how things that happen right now are going to continue to shape our physiology over days or weeks or much less decades. And that incubation problem is a really hard one mechanistically to solve. How is it that experience gets embedded or becomes sticky and stays within the body? As we know, not all young people exposed to adversity have adverse outcomes. In fact, most of the work that we've done and others suggests that it's something like 50-50, that about half the kids exposed to adversity will have the health problem later on that you're studying and half won't. So that suggests that as important as it is to understand risk and the mechanisms associated with it, it's at least as important to understand resilience and who's protected. And our work increasingly is focusing on that question and trying to identify protective and vulnerability factors that moderate who's going to have health problems secondary to these sorts of adversities and who's not. And then to use that information and leverage it to inform practices and inform policies that might mitigate some of these effects. And that's really the goal of our research. So I've made the assumption up till now that this is likely to be a causal effect, where things that happen to you during childhood causally down the line affect your risk for various chronic diseases associated with aging and physical health problems. Now, there are alternative explanations for these patterns I've shown you, and I think they're worth considering because we can't just jump to the conclusion that things are causal. We've done that too many times in research and found out we're wrong. So we need to give the alternative explanation some serious thought. One of them is that these aren't truly causal associations and that this is really about genetics. And many people see findings like this and they say, well, here's another scenario. That other scenario is that there is a set of genes that confer risk for various life outcomes that range from physical health problems like heart disease, to mental health problems like depression, to labor market problems like low educational attainment and low income. And these genes cluster within families, and parents pass them on to kids. And as a result of this clustering of risk genes within families, you see associations between things like your childhood socioeconomic status and your later health problems that aren't truly a causal effect, but all arise from these common risk genes. So it's a plausible argument. It's kind of a hard one to test because it's not really a testable argument, right? Most of the outcomes we're talking about are determined by thousands and thousands of genes, and we just don't have the statistical models to really take that apart and say, is it true? What you can do is you can look to animal studies, and in those animal studies, you can manipulate the early life conditions that rats and monkeys find themselves in and make those conditions more or less enriched. And then you can follow the animals until they get to be older animals and see whether the animals have heart attacks and strokes and cancers and things like that. And what you see in those animal studies, where genetics aren't a possible confound because you're manipulating the nature of the early environment, is that early experience has a causal and demonstrable effect on later life disease risks. So the animal models are certainly consistent with the kind of causal scenario I'm talking about. Now you might say, look, these are animal models. How do you set up a rodent situation that resembles a child exposed to poverty? And I would say, you're absolutely right. It's not a perfect model, but most of medical research relies on animal models to do that kind of basic testing, and we often have to extrapolate because you can't do that study in humans. Except for that you can do an alternative version of it if you go to databases that are available in Northern Europe, where they keep really good track of adoptions, and they keep really good track of education and income, and they keep really good track of health, and they allow researchers to combine these databases. And using those sorts of linked databases, you can ask questions like, if a child is adopted from a birth family who has limited resources into an adoptive family who has more resources, or vice versa, what does their health look like across the life course? And that's sort of a natural version of the animal experiment I was telling you about. And what you find in those studies is, again, that the socioeconomic status of the adoptive family does tell you something about people's long-term health risks. And so does the adoptive status, or the socioeconomic status of the birth family. So what those studies, I think, the conclusion they come to is that there's probably some common genetic liability. That this argument about it really being about bad genes is partially right, but it's certainly not the whole story. That the environment that kids grow up in seems to also play perhaps an equally strong role in long-term health problems. So I think this is a piece of the story, but it's certainly not just reducible to this. The other argument about these findings, or alternative view, is that they're really not about childhood socioeconomic circumstances. Particularly in the United States today, there's sadly little economic mobility from generation to generation. In general, kids who grow up in lower income families are most likely to become lower income adults. And the converse is true of kids who grow up in higher income families. We have less mobility than we think, and certainly less mobility than other wealthy industrialized nations. So one argument that people often make with the findings I've shown you is that this isn't really about kids exposed to adversity having worse health outcomes. It's about kids exposed to adversity becoming adults exposed to adversity, and it's what happens in middle age or later age that causes people to have early heart attacks, early strokes, early death. So there's nothing here really about childhood. And I don't think that's true. I think that's part of the story, for sure, because it is the case that we have limited mobility economically across the life course, and it is the case that what happens to you in middle age and late middle age contributes to your risk for chronic diseases associated with aging. But the best studies show that there's also this unique and separate effect of early childhood, SES, and other experiences that's apart from what happens in adulthood. So for example, here's a study done this is a study of about 1,500 physicians who graduated from Hopkins Medical School in the 50s and 60s. These are all men, because at that point, Hopkins only took men into their medical school. And what they did is follow these physicians out until their mid-70s, over a 40-year period, and they looked at risk for heart disease. And again, similar to an earlier slide I showed you, the study used a really crude metric for dividing the physicians into those who came from families that had higher versus lower childhood SES. This is based on father's occupation being manual versus non-manual. And what you see here, or maybe you don't see because the slide didn't reproduce well, I apologize, is that risk of heart disease in this group, remember, these are all Hopkins graduated physicians, right? So as adults, they are high in socioeconomic status by any metric we have. They have lots of educational attainment, lots of occupational prestige, presumably lots of income. This is the cream of the crop of our society in many people's eyes in terms of SES. Even among this group of highly, highly privileged men, there are differences in risk of heart disease according to childhood socioeconomic status. Again, suggesting that mobility alone or adult SES doesn't take away what seems to be the influence of early experience, or the stickiness of disadvantage, as we call it. All right, so if we take those two alternative explanations off the table for a moment and we say there might be some role of genetics, there might be some role of adult SES, but there's still something left over after that for early childhood experience. How does it happen? How do you get from early SES or other adversity under the skin into the body, and how do you keep it there across decades to create subsequent risk for later health problems? So lots of people have drawn models that look like this one to explain it. This is our particular take on it, but it's by no means unique or solitary. Many of these models have a set of kind of common core assumptions, which is that kids who grow up in disadvantaged circumstances have a set of social and physical exposures that they disproportionately experience. And on the social side, especially in the United States today, kids who grow up in disadvantaged families and communities are more likely to live in households that have unstable caregiving, right? You know, lots of particularly father and male caregiver exits and entrances. Sociology literature documents that fairly extensively. That there's going to be, on average, and this isn't always the case, but on average in lower income families, less availability and less sensitivity of primary caregivers for kids. There's going to be more household chaos. There's going to be more conflict. There's going to be more crowding. There's going to be more exposure to conflict and violence, not only in the home, but in the neighborhood. And again, I don't want to say this is true of every low-income family. It's absolutely not true, but on average, these are the trends. And on the physical environment side, in today's United States, you also see that kids growing up in low-income families are likely to be exposed to more toxicants and pollutants because factories and traffic pollution and things like that aren't equally distributed across neighborhoods because of the way we set up our cities. And the argument is that those differential social and physical exposures in early life shape the way the brain develops, right? That the kind of parenting one experiences, that exposure to stressors like violence and material deprivation, that pollutants, all those things in small ways and in large ways shape the way that different regions of our brain develop in the way that Bob talked about, particularly in the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex, and that early influence on brain development has profound implications for how we develop as people, for how we engage and relate to our social world, to the mates and partners we choose, to how we interact with them, and how we go on to develop a family. Also to the way that we respond to stress and that we respond to reward, to the kind of lifestyle choices we make and the behaviors we engage in. And that through those pathways, one's going to see differences in the way that bodily systems function, and our particular focus has been on the immune system. I'll tell you more about that later. So we think a lot about those pathways, how those exposures lead to changes in brain development and subsequent development of, you might call it personality, you might call it behavior. That might be a little too individual focused for this crowd, but in the personality world, that's what people would talk about. There's also more of a classic kind of David Barker hypothesis embedded within many people's thinking, including ours, and that's this hypothesis that people have called programming. It's common in the developmental origins of health and disease literature, and this is the idea that Michael Meany and Moshe Ziff's work has pointed to, and that's that early experiences have the potential to get biologically embedded in certain cells. And a lot of the talk has been around epigenetic mechanisms through which that could occur. And by embedding, what people mean is that the experience, typically a pretty severe major stressor or trauma, somehow happening during a critical or sensitive period of brain development or of immune cell development, can get left as a mark in that cell's DNA through these epigenetic mechanisms, and in doing so, affect the way that that cell is going to behave for many years and possibly decades to come. And I think most people's thinking now about these effects have kind of matured. Historically, when I say historically, I mean this field's in its infancy. It's only been around for about 10 or 15 years. I would say for most of the field, most of that history, people have been divided into two camps in thinking about how all of this could unfold. There are the programming folks who come from the animal model world and that Meany and Ziff's work draws on. And then there are the more lifespan personality development folks who say, we don't really know much about this programming stuff, but we do know that the experiences that people have in childhood really affect the kinds of adults they become. Basic insight, going back a couple hundred years in psychology at least, and much longer than that. And that both of these things almost have to be true, right? That the evidence suggests that these are not mutually exclusive explanations, and the story is way more complex than either group gives it credit for. So as I said, our group has focused pretty heavily. Going the wrong direction, sorry. And I think I've confused my computer. Nope. And now it won't let me go. There we go. Sorry about this. You're getting a quick summary. So I told you that we focus a lot on the immune system here. And the reason we focus on the immune system is because our interest is explaining long-term health outcomes, particularly chronic diseases associated with aging. So we've been historically very interested in heart disease, stroke, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, and how early life experiences relates to them. And so you say, well, why would you focus on the immune system? Well, it turns out that in the last decade or so, it's become really clear that low-level inflammation, what people call non-resolving inflammation, is one of the major pathophysiological characteristics of most diseases of aging. Now, again, this isn't all that matters for these diseases, but if there's one kind of common mechanistic pathway that links obesity with some cancers, with MS and asthma and inflammatory bowel disease and heart disease, it's this low-level, mild, ongoing inflammation. And so one of our kind of research arms has been trying to understand whether the kinds of experiences people have in early life around SES and abuse and social relationships basically programs or affects the way cells respond to stimuli and the kinds of inflammatory responses they have, which in turn changes their risk for these diseases. And I'm going to tell you about some studies that look at that hypothesis. In a really simplistic way, what you can think about here is the idea that the cells that initiate and maintain inflammation, they're called monocytes in their immature form, and they become macrophages once they mature, are cells that have a tremendous amount of phenotypic plasticity. So by that, I mean that they enter an environment in the body, whether they enter your lungs or your big toe or your heart, and they go in and adapt to the circumstances in which they find themselves. They can become very aggressive responders, or they can become less aggressive responders. And our argument is that the environment in which people are raised, whether it's more disadvantaged or more advantaged, tilts the balance of that phenotypic plasticity in certain directions, and that kids raised in more disadvantaged environments have cells that on balance are more aggressive responders when they encounter microbial stimuli like viruses and bacteria, or when they encounter signals that something is going wrong, like some cell is injured through trauma or dying, that those cells are also not only more reactive and more responsive to stimuli that get them into gear, but those cells are also less responsive to stimuli that are meant to slow down that inflammatory response. So they react more and they calm down less. And then as a result of those tendencies, over the life course, people who grow up in more disadvantaged environments experience more ups and fewer downs of that inflammatory response and have more of this chronic low-level inflammation that contributes, along with a host of other factors, to risk for chronic diseases of aging. So let me go a little bit further with this so you can get a better sense of what I'm describing here. So I'm going to show you here a picture of macrophage. So this is the cell I'm talking about. And what you can see here is that you've got this cell, and it has noticed that up there in the orange, there is bacterium. And there are a couple of things I want you to take away from this cartoon. So one is that the cell has this purple receptor up here on its surface. And the way the cell recognizes bacteria in the environment is the bacteria carry this little molecule called LPS, or endotoxin, or lipopolysaccharide. And when your immune cells see that LPS molecule, they know that a certain species of bacteria is present in the environment. And when that LPS molecule binds to your macrophage or monocyte, it kicks off this signaling cascade. And you don't need to know all the abbreviations up here in detail, but what I can tell you is that ultimately that signaling cascade results in this molecule right here getting activated. This molecule is called nuclear factor kappa beta. That's one I want you to remember, NF kappa B. The reason it's called a nuclear factor is because when it gets activated through this bacterial stimulus, it moves into the nucleus. That's why it's a nuclear factor. And what it does in the nucleus, if you remember back to your high school biology, or your kids' high school biology, like in my case, what it does is it moves into the nucleus and it turns on genes, right? It turns on genes that code for communication molecules that allow immune cells to fight off the infection, right? And so again, the cell is going to sense bacteria are present because that LPS molecule is on the bacteria. It's going to start this signaling cascade. Nuclear factor kappa B is going to get activated. It's going to move into the nucleus, and it's going to turn on these genes. And when those genes get turned on, you're ultimately going to produce these communication molecules that immune cells use to mount their attack. And those communication molecules are called interleukins. So interleukin 6 is a common one, interleukin 1, TNF alpha. And when we measure inflammation, or we measure how reactive cells are, we often use model systems like this, where we draw blood from a research participant, and in a test tube, we expose it to bacteria. And then we measure how much of this accumulates, and we measure over a few hours how much of these interleukins get produced by the cell. So instead of injecting bacteria directly into a kid, which we couldn't do ethically, we do it all in a test tube. Now, I talked a lot a couple of slides ago about the idea that early adversity might ramp up this kind of response. Now, that's only part of the story here, because one of the things that we know is that how responsive your cells are matters partly, but what might matter even more is how good your system is at shutting that response down when the threat is no longer there, right? So to get rid of bacteria, to heal a wound, you need your immune cells to get it activated. You need them to migrate to the site where the infection or the trauma is. But then when the threat is gone, they need to stand down. So how do they stand down? Well, one of the things that the body does to get them to stand down is these interleukins actually go into the brain and they activate the HPA axis to release cortisol. So this is where all of these different talks you're hearing are going to come full circle. The immune system actually tells the brain, release cortisol. Cortisol is the body's version of a drug that many of us use on a regular basis. So if you have a rash, if you have a bug bite, you often go to your local CVS or Walgreens and you buy a synthetic version of cortisol called hydrocortisone cream, right? There's a reason that when you have an inflammatory problem, you use synthetic versions of cortisol, or if you have a serious autoimmune disease or asthma, that your physician will prescribe something like prednisone, which is also a synthetic version of cortisol. And the reason that those synthetic versions of cortisol are so effective at reducing inflammatory problems is that what cortisol does is it crosses the cell membrane and it binds to a receptor inside the cell called the glucocorticoid receptor. And that complex basically tethers nuclear factor kappa B and traps it so it can't move into the nucleus and turn on these genes. So again, this is the molecular way that the hydrocortisone cream that you're using on your bug bites or your rashes stops the inflammation. Basically, it prevents this linchpin molecule, this nuclear factor, from moving in here and starting the response. So we're going to study that too. I'm going to show you some test tube experiments where we take kids' cells, we put them into a test tube, we add bacteria, and then we add cortisol, and we see what happens. Are kids differentially sensitive to cortisol's ability to kind of shut down or make that inflammatory response stand down when it needs to? So our first foray into this work was about 15 years ago, and we did a very simple study just to see if the hypotheses we had about early experience and bacterial responses and inflammation might be in the ballpark of right. And so what we did in this study is just recruit a small number of young adults. These are people between the ages of 25 and 40. And we recruited them such that half came from families that were high and half came from families that were low in socioeconomic status. And you can imagine the higher socioeconomic status are ones where parents had high prestige occupations, physicians, attorneys, bankers, scientists. Lower socioeconomic status families had more clerical and service types of occupations. Now, to make sure that this wasn't simply about people's current socioeconomic status, we also did some fancy matching to make sure that there weren't differences between the groups on their current socioeconomic status. So by design, we think we kind of isolated the effects of early SES. And then we took people's blood samples and in a test tube, we challenged them with bacterial stimuli and viral stimuli and looked to see how much of these interleukins that coordinate the inflammatory response the cells produced. And what we saw in this first paper, this is many years ago, was that subjects who came from families of lower socioeconomic status produced more of interleukin-6 in both response to a bacterial stimuli and in response to a viral stimulus. And we see this across multiple different markers of inflammation and across multiple different kinds of stimuli that get the immune system worked up. This is a pretty consistent pattern we see. So what does this tell us? You might be thinking now, well, this is interesting, but isn't a bigger response better? Like, don't you want your immune system to respond aggressively to a virus or a bacterium? Isn't that what you want? And I would say, yeah, actually, you probably do, right? In the context of an invading microorganism that's going to give you the flu or give you gastroenteritis or give you food poisoning, don't you want your immune cells going after it more strongly? I would say, yeah, you probably do. That's probably an adaptive response in the context of that acute infectious threat. What we would argue is that, yes, it's adaptive in the short term, but it comes at a long-term cost, right? And this is probably going to be a familiar line of argument for this audience. And the cost is that if you're constantly revving this system up more than it needs to be revved up, that over the life course, there's going to be a cost to that. And the cost is that on the back end, these constant ups and downs of the inflammatory response to a greater degree than needed is going to enhance your risk for other health problems related to autoimmune diseases, related to heart diseases, related to some cancers, which seem to be in part about the cumulative inflammatory load across the life course. So that's not to say this is pathological. In fact, it may be a very sensible trade-off in the moment, at the time. And you can imagine, for lots of reasons, that many low-income kids, both in the United States and worldwide, do grow up in environments that have very different kinds of microbial loads than higher income kids do. There often tend to be differences, even in the contemporary United States, in the degree of household crowding, level of sanitation, presence of animals and pets, and all sorts of other microbial environment differences that vary by SES in this country that may make perfect sense for lower income kids in those contexts to have more aggressive responses to deal with the different microbial environments. So we also did some more kind of in-depth profiling of how these research subject cells were behaving using genomics technology. I'm not going to go into the details here, but if people have questions later, I can. Let me just say that what we find is that subjects who came from lower income families had more activation of this nuclear factor kappa B molecule that I was telling you about. Again, this is kind of the linchpin of the inflammatory response. This is the thing that moves into the nucleus and switches on those genes. And what we find is that people from low-income backgrounds tend to have, even when their cells aren't challenged, when their cells are kind of calm and resting, more activity along this pathway. And their cells also tend to have less activity that is reflective of how engaged cortisol is. One way to think about this is that GR represents glucocorticoid receptor. So that's that receptor that binds cortisol and tethers NF-kappa B so that it can't switch on the pro-inflammatory genes. One simple metaphor for thinking about this is NF-kappa B is like the gas pedal to get the inflammatory response started, and the glucocorticoid receptor is like the brakes. And what the pattern we see in adults who came from more disadvantaged childhoods is that the gas pedal is on harder and the brakes don't work as well, meaning that there's more cumulative inflammation. Those of you who are more developmentally minded, I suspect that's most of you, might say, all right, so you're studying young adults and studying you're studying their immune responses as young adults as a function of their early childhood experiences around socioeconomic status. What's going on in childhood, right? There's a long gap. And that's been a little bit of a challenging question for us to answer logistically because getting blood samples from really young kids is a challenge for various reasons. We've done studies as young as age 9 where we see exactly the same pattern. So this is a study where we followed kids across childhood between birth and age 9 and characterized their socioeconomic status along trajectories. This is a Canadian sample where there actually was more mobility than you typically would see in an American sample, and you can categorize them stably low, stably high, mid-high, so these are kind of 4 SES trajectory groups, and then there's a group of families that had increasing SES across their kids' childhood. And then when the kids are age 9, we drew blood, we challenged it with bacterial stimuli in a test tube, and we looked more at this interleukin production. And what you can see here is that there's this dose-response effect, that the kids with stably low socioeconomic status produced by far the largest inflammatory response at age 9, followed by those middle high, and those at the highest level of SES stably had the smallest responses. This group, the increasing SES group, actually looks like they were high in SES, suggesting that this might be telling us something about current socioeconomic conditions as opposed to what happened early on. But as you can see, already by age 9, I think the point here is that there are differences in immune response that line up with socioeconomic conditions. So you might be saying, all right, age 9, what about between ages 1 and 9? Can we see this in newborns? Can we see this in infants? Can we see this in early childhood? How early does it go? Well, the answer is that we haven't done these studies before age 9 because getting blood from 3- and 4-year-old children, is challenging, questionably ethical. We haven't really been able to do the study, so we don't know. Could you pick it up in a pediatrician's office? But thinking about that question has actually taken us into studies that I never thought I'd do on pregnancy. And so now we've been working for the past 3 or 4 years on studies of pregnancy and trying to find out whether actually some of the exposure and some of the inflammation occurs in utero. So this is a picture of a baby, and the critical part here I want you to look at is the placenta, this organ right here. And the placenta, as you likely know, is the interface between the baby or the fetus and the mother. And the placenta is where there's critical exchange, where mom sends baby oxygen and nutrients, baby sends mom waste and carbon dioxide. And it all occurs here. These are maternal blood vessels. In them are nutrients and oxygen. They get passed through these villus structures to the baby and nourish the baby during development. And as it turns out, there can be a fair amount of inflammation in the placenta. Some of it due to infectious causes, some of it due to the mom's immune system reacting against the baby. Some of it for unknown reasons. And when there is inflammation in the placenta, it can interfere profoundly with the transfer of nutrients and oxygen to mom and baby, with long-term implications for kids' health, particular brain development. So we're going to be focusing on the studies I'm going to tell you about on this particular part of the placenta. So when you talk to a pathologist about the placenta, they divide it into sort of 3 parts, right? So there is the basal plate. This is the maternal side, often called the decidua. That's one compartment. There are the membranes, right? You guys know these membranes. They're the ones that rupture right before delivery occurs. And then there's this villus structure right here. So let me tell you just a little bit about this villus structure. So these chorionic villi, they look like trees here, right? So there's a series of these chorionic villi, and this is where maternal blood, with its nutrients and with its oxygen, passes into the baby's circulation. So these villi are the site where nutrient and oxygen exchange occurs. And all these villi ultimately feed in to the umbilical cord, where things flow to the baby's circulation and it gets nourished. And we're going to be focusing in the next couple of studies on whether inflammation occurs in this villus layer of the placenta where all that exchange occurs. So the first thing we did, and actually I can show you some microscopy. So on the top, you have a slide of a cross-section of a normal, healthy villus structure. And what you can see in there is that the red dots right there are fetal capillaries, right? Those are capillaries where maternal blood has passed into fetal capillaries, oxygen-rich, nutrient-rich blood, and then is going to eventually make its way to the umbilical cord and to the baby. Top one's healthy. This bottom slide here, particularly this villus tree right here, you can see by this asterisk, there are all these purple dots. And those purple dots are cells that have infiltrated. They're immune cells. We don't know whether they're from the mother, from the baby, or where they're from, but there's a large infiltration of cells. And what you don't see here is any fetal capillaries. It's a little bit hard probably from the back of the room, but basically the inflammatory response here has basically obliterated the fetal blood flow, so nutrients can't pass. And it's in this one. But you can see that in these adjacent villi, there is blood flow, there are capillaries. So it's not total obliteration. This is the low-grade version of inflammation in the villus structure. So in one of our first studies in this area, we just asked a very, again, simple question. Does the rate of this inflammation in the villus tree differ for moms of different socioeconomic resources? And the answer was stunningly yes. So there is this very strongly graded relationship between maternal household income and the prevalence of chronic inflammatory lesions in the placenta. So you can see that for women at the bottom end of the income distribution, less than $30,000 a year, about half of them showed on examination a chronic inflammatory lesion in one of the placental compartments, compared to women at the higher end of the scale where the rates were more like 30%. So there's about a 50% relative difference in the rate of these lesions between higher and lower income women, with middle income women being intermediate between those. So this is evidence suggesting that the inflammation starts in utero. One of the other things we did, and this is where we kind of went pretty far outside of our comfort zone, which is already outside the comfort zone of most psychologists. So normally what we've done is we bring people into our laboratory and we draw blood and we expose their blood and test tubes to things, which, you know, is not what most psychologists do, but we're kind of nutty and people have gotten used to it. In this recent study, we actually sent our graduate students and some of our trainees to labor and delivery units. And as soon as the babies were born, if the women agreed, we took their placentas and we had the graduate students take biopsies of the placentas. And then we take the placental tissue and we study the molecules that are present in it using genomics technology. So you had all these psychology graduate students going into delivery rooms with scalpels and biopsying placentas, which of great amusement to many people in the university. They said, what is that? I had a dean ask me once, he's like, why do you guys keep asking for these like scalpels and these laboratory things? I thought psychologists needed couches to do their research. So when we biopsy those placentas and analyze them, we get a gene expression profile that I won't go into details again here, but what we see in the more socioeconomically disadvantaged women is a pattern of inflammation and immune activation in the placenta. Again, similar to the pattern that I showed you on the last slide, where we're looking at placentas under a microscope and just saying, is there a lesion or is there not a lesion? Here we're taking apart those lesions and doing some kind of high-tech profiling of what molecules and what genes are more or less expressed. And they basically show the same pattern, but at a more micro level, and give us some clues about what the actors are and aren't. And the details here, I think, aren't that critical. We also see, interestingly, so there's an upregulation of these immune activation genes in the placentas of lower income women. There's also, at the same time, a downregulation of genes that support different aspects of fetal development. And if you remember a few slides back, one of the things I told you is that when there is inflammation in the placenta, it can interfere with nutrients and oxygen exchange from mom to baby. And those nutrients and oxygen are vital for babies' fetal development in the brain, in the heart, in the lungs. And what we see here is evidence that the signals that help fetuses grow, hearts and lungs and brains, are turned down a little bit in the placentas of lower income women. That's not to say at all that these babies are turning out with different brain structures, different heart structures. We don't know that. We didn't study that. We don't know what the functional and kind of phenotypic implications of this stuff are. That requires a whole other set of studies, and they may be none. But what we can tell you is that the placenta of low-income women is a different environment than it is of higher income women at this point. There's more inflammation, and there are less of these pro-growth signals that presumably are going to relate to the strongest levels of brain and heart and lung development. And that's what we've seen for now. Again, these are kind of early stage studies. We need to do more work to understand what's happening. And I would also just sort of end this section by saying, I want to echo the comment that came out in the first panel discussion that for shorthand, we often talk about these as effects of poverty or as effects of socioeconomic disadvantage. And we talk about them in ways that suggest they're about the individual woman or the individual child or the individual family. And that shorthand, and I often don't catch myself soon enough in the talk of saying, I don't see these as individual features of women or families. I see them as decisions that our society has made about how we're going to allocate resources and how we're going to set policy and how we're going to set up people's lives that filter down to make people have more or fewer resources. So the message I don't want you to take away from this is that poor Americans make bad choices or do bad things that harm their bodies and harm their babies. That's not what this is about. This is a very interconnected, multi-level problem that's a reflection of the way that we've set up society that filters down into families and women's and kids' lives. And the next part of the talk, I think, will get more at that. But before anybody kind of takes that conclusion, I want to stop it. So I've talked a lot about the how and the why, right? So that was a brief but probably more detailed tour of our kind of mechanistic research trying to understand the process, the how. What I want to pivot to now is this idea that, all right, so that explains part of the risk side of the equation. That gives us a feel for how it might be that on average, kids growing up in lower income contexts might come to develop biological tendencies that increase their disease risk later in life. But as I said, that's only part of the story, at best half of it. The other half is, all right, so who are the kids who stay healthy? And how do those protective factors work? What can we learn about these kids and their families and their communities that promote resilience and that we can leverage to create better lives? And going in the wrong direction again here. So to start addressing this issue, you can look at the literature in the subfield of developmental psychopathology. And this is research that's been going on for the better part of half a century, and that way predates our entry into this work and has, I think, really elegantly shown that for low-income kids, there are two really consistently identified protective factors that are associated with better academic outcomes, better psychosocial outcomes, better criminal justice outcomes. This work started, I think, in some ways with Emmy Werner's classical work in Kauai in her longitudinal study there, but has continued to this day. And those two protective factors, the first one is going to be not surprising and interesting to you guys, is nurturant caregiving, right? So all of the literature from Werner's study on forward suggests that low-income kids who have a nurturant caregiver in their life, which could be a parent, but could also be a teacher, could also be a relative, could also be a mentor, go on to have academic and psychosocial outcomes that look very similar to kids from more privileged backgrounds. And that an involved nurturing caregiver can make a massive difference in kids' lives. That is very evident from the literature. The other protective factor that I would say comes out looking quite strong and quite consistent is self-regulation. And again, this won't be surprising. So we know that kids who have high levels of self-regulation, whether you define that as executive function or whether you define it as something a little broader like self-control, I think there's a lot of definitional ambiguity in the literature. Elizabeth may want to talk about this later, about what exactly self-regulation is. But basically, I would say that kids who are able to stay focused on the long-term, more abstract goals and not get taken off track by the more short-term immediate gratifications tend to do well academically, tend to do well emotionally, tend to do well health-wise, even if they come from low-income backgrounds. So our work over the last, say, 5 years or so has been really trying to ask the question of, okay, there are these two strong protective factors for psychopathology and for educational outcomes. Are they also protective factors for the kinds of health outcomes we study? So if you take a low-income kid and he or she has high levels of nurturant caregiving or high levels of self-regulation, does that also protect him or her from gaining weight, from diabetes, from heart disease, from those sorts of things? And here the story gets interesting. So the first thing we did to address this question is to go back to those old studies and say, all right, so in addition to asking people about what their parents' education and occupation was when they were children, we asked them to tell us retrospectively about their relationships with their parents. Now, this isn't the best way to do things. We know that people's retrospective reports of their childhood experiences are, at best colored through the lenses of what's happening in their life right now and how things have turned out. People often go looking for explanations for either really positive or really negative outcomes, and they reconstruct. We all reconstruct different versions of our lives, and particularly the versions about how we related to our parents. So this isn't the best way to do things, but doing the right longitudinal study where you do what Elizabeth does and capture people early in life and then follow them for 30 or 40 years is a little bit prohibitive financially and logistically. So we can start with this sort of approach. And we found that when we went back and did that, and we looked at the activity of some of those signaling pathways that support inflammation, the punchline was that if we took if we took the adults who grew up in low-income households and we asked them about early maternal warmth, the ones who reported retrospectively that they had lots of warmth and nurturance from their moms looked, in terms of inflammation, just like the adults who had come from higher income backgrounds. That almost all of the effects we saw on immune cell signaling, on NF-kappa B, on the gas pedal and the brakes that I told you about, go away in kids raised in low-income but highly nurturing families. So again, these findings are consistent with the idea from the developmental psychopathology literature that a nurturing caregiver, and in particular a maternal caregiver in the case of this study, are strong buffers against the long-term kinds of immunologic and potentially health consequences of early disadvantage. But again, this is a small first study. We were skeptical. We tried to deal with plausible alternative explanations like, okay, maybe it's just that the subjects who report retrospectively being in a nurturing early environment are ones who are less depressed at this point, are in better relationships, and we evaluated all those potential alternative explanations and came up with no evidence that this was just simply a reporting bias or a social desirability bias. But we still didn't completely trust the findings, and as you'll see, we've kept trying to chase after this in the subsequent years to convince ourselves that it's either true or not true. So we went to the MIDAS study, which again is this great data set that's followed midlife adults for 20 or 30 years now, and we asked, all right, if we look at early socioeconomic conditions and we look at retrospective reports again of maternal nurturance, do they relate to cardiovascular risk later in life? This was a much bigger sample. That earlier study I showed you last slide was maybe 100 people. This is more like 1,200 people. And we saw the same exact pattern in this analysis. So here we're looking at, in midlife, the prevalence of metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is a collection of cardiovascular risk factors that include high levels of cholesterol, high fasting blood sugar, high blood pressure, abdominal adiposity. It tends to put people at risk for diabetes and for heart disease. And what you see in this graph is that this is childhood socioeconomic status. So basically, did your father and mother have a degree that fit into one of these categories? And on this axis, you have metabolic syndrome. And what you see is that there's this general negative slope, meaning that as your childhood socioeconomic status goes up, you're less likely as an adult to have metabolic syndrome. That's the general trend. And again, this is independent of your education and income as an adult. But what you can see is that the strength of that relationship between childhood SES and adult metabolic syndrome varies considerably depending on how you retrospectively recall your relationship with your mom. It's a very steep gradient if you recall your mom not being very nurturing, right? You can see that red line here is a steep gradient. If you recall high levels of nurturance, that line is basically flat. Your childhood socioeconomic conditions are completely unrelated to your adult metabolic syndrome. Again, bigger sample, different outcome, same sort of pattern, consistent with the idea that a positive early caregiving environment can strongly offset any risks associated with early socioeconomic adversity. That relationships, like the developmental psychopathology literature would suggest, can be quite effective buffers against adversity. So, even though those second set of findings were stronger than the first in lots of different ways that people will argue about, ultimately, those are both observational studies. And as a result, they're subject to all sorts of alternative explanations that would suggest that maybe they're not causal. Maybe that there's something we're missing that's creating a spurious relationship. So the only way to really answer that charge is to do an experiment where we randomly assign people to a condition that improves parenting or improves nurturance and compare their health to people who didn't get that intervention. This would be a very complicated and expensive study to do from the ground up. We were lucky, as we were starting this work, to meet a collaborator named Gene Brody, who's at the University of Georgia, who had done a study like this. And Gene has worked for about 30 years with rural African-American communities around Georgia. And he has done a spectacular job in that period of spending many, many days and weeks in those communities, getting to know families, getting to know community figures and religious figures, getting to know schools, and cultivating a deep understanding of the challenges and the opportunities in those communities. And after doing that for decades, with tons of input from the communities, he developed a series of intervention programs. The one I'm going to talk about today is called Strong African American Families. And one of those interventions was tested in a large-scale randomized clinical trial that happened about 15 years ago. And let me tell you a little bit about it. So Strong African American Families, as you can imagine, is a family-oriented intervention. It starts with 11-year-old kids who were in 5th grade and a caregiver, typically a maternal caregiver. All these studies, again, as I said, are in African-American communities in the rural South, so small towns ranging from the hundreds to maybe the 10 to 12 to 15,000 size towns. The intervention is fairly low-key, so it's 8 weekly sessions of 2 hours, almost always held at a community center, at a school, at a church, and led by community facilitators, not by academics. So academics have input on the content of the intervention and the analysis, but work with community members on the administration. Each 2-hour session is structured so that during the first hour, groups of 8 to 10 parents go in one direction with the community facilitator, and their children go in another direction. And the parents and kids have separate first hours, and then they come together for the second hour. The curriculum for the parents focuses on a couple of different things. So one is trying to introduce this concept of nurturant, involved, vigilant parenting, which is a mouthful, but I think you guys get at what I'm talking about here. It's not the version of parenting you see on TV. It's very contextually sensitive. There's a lot of focus on helping parents understand the challenges that their kids are going to face as Black youth growing up in the rural South in the United States today. It's very frank about racism at both the individual level, the community level, the institutional level. It's very frank about the challenges around drug use and sex that kids are going to face as they enter this middle school phase. And what it tries to do is make parents aware of these challenges, prepare them to have frank discussions with their children about what the challenges will be and what the expectations from the family are going to be around drugs and sex, and to help the parents develop strategies for communicating with their kids about these challenges and helping the kids navigate them as they go through them. Gene calls it nutrient-involved vigilant parenting. And the way he describes this is that, and I've seen some of the tapes, is that parents are really encouraged to be in their kids' business, to be frank. The idea is that, this is a challenging time as kids transition into middle school. I have a kid transitioning to middle school right now, so can identify with some of the challenges developmentally. And that, as opposed to giving your kids blanket freedom or, gratifying their wishes for blanket freedom and autonomy at this period, you probably need to be as involved, if perhaps not more involved than you were when they were younger. And not to do that in a way that is overly hovering, overly critical, overly harsh, but to really spend time each day checking in with your child, monitoring, and intervening when problems start, as opposed to when they fester. The kids get lots of intervention curriculum focused on setting and achieving goals. So thinking about what they want to do in the short term and long term, and developing effective strategies for articulating those goals and following through with them. For coping with stressors that occur along the way, particularly stressors related to race and class, and a lot of focus on resisting peer pressure related to sex and drugs. So this was originally designed as an intervention, as you might imagine, to reduce rates of risky sexual behavior, to reduce uptake of drugs and alcohol during adolescence, and to improve academic performance. And it was incredibly successful at all those things. So compared to a control group, the families in the intervention showed much lower rates of alcohol and drug use as they transitioned in adolescence and adulthood, had better academic outcomes, were more likely to go to college, had fewer interactions with the criminal justice system. Very effective intervention. We were able, in collaboration with Gene, to go back and do another study of the kids when they hit age 19, and as part of that study, collect blood samples to test the hypothesis that this sort of intervention might also influence kids' health. 8 years later, because remember, they went in at age 11. And so at age 19, we collected a small blood sample. We measured a bunch of markers of inflammation. And just to give you a sense for what the sample looked like, so you can see about 2/3 of these families have a high school education, a minority have some college, about 10% have an associate's degree or higher. 2/3 of the families are single-parent households, and about half the sample is below the federal poverty line. So as you can see, this is a relatively disadvantaged sample, consistent with the demographics of the rural South. And what we find is that when we draw blood at age 19, we see substantially lower levels of inflammation in the kids who got the Strong African American Families intervention relative to the control. And the controls got basically a series of mailings about optimal strategies for child development, but none of the focus on the topics I discussed. So this is across 6 different measures of inflammation, and you can see there's about a half a standard deviation difference, it turns out, between the groups 8 years later. So you can also ask, all right, wow, at the end, these groups look very different in terms of inflammation. Is any of this about parenting? That intervention I told you about is complex, right? It works on kids, it works on goals, it works on resisting drug use. What was the magic ingredient? And we can look at some of this in these sort of path model sorts of ways. We measured, in the study, parenting was measured repeatedly. One of the things we can show is that some chunk of the difference in inflammation at age 19, maybe about 1/3 of it to a half of it, depending on how you slice it, is about changes in parenting. So it turns out that one of the things the intervention does is it increases this nurturant-involved parenting, and at the same time, it decreases harsh and inconsistent parenting. And we measure those things separately, and what we find is that parents who, as a result of this intervention, decrease harshness, decrease inconsistency, at the same time increase nurturing and supportive behaviors, their kids are the ones who show less inflammation 8 years down the line. But it takes both of those, that families who just decrease harsh and inconsistent parenting don't get the inflammatory reduction. It takes both the positive and the negative changes in our analyses. So again, these data are consistent with the idea that there's possibly a true causal effect here, that you can leverage this knowledge about early nurturance being an offset to early disadvantage and use it potentially to change kids' health trajectories. And we've done subsequent analyses, which I don't have slides for today, to show that we see same sorts of patterns if you look at metabolic syndrome risk, diabetes risk. If you look at different measures of brain development, we've done some brain imaging to look at hippocampal development and prefrontal cortex development. So this intervention in this particular context seems to have fairly widespread effects on different parts of the body and different parts of the brain that offset some of the consequences of poverty that we see in other contexts. There was a question.
Did you study the health of the parents as well?
No, that is a great idea. I wish we would have. I wish we would have. So I've talked a lot about early relationships, right? So the idea implicit in all this is that the buffer is actually when kids are experiencing some of the disadvantages of growing up in a low-income family or community, that a nurturant caregiver, whether it be a parent or a teacher, can kind of in real time offset the risks going forward. You might ask, well, we see a lot of patients in our practice who had early adversity and they're midlife adults or later. Can we do anything for them, right? Is there any way to reverse things, or is there any way to compensate for some of those early experiences? That's a hard question to answer. We started to take a look at it. So you remember this slide from the beginning where I showed you those findings on differential mortality according to child abuse. Well, one of the things we just did with a postdoc of ours in the last 6 months is say, oh, this MIDAS study that we analyzed not only has reports of childhood abuse, but it has reports about the quality of people's midlife relationships. And we asked, if we look at the combination of early physical abuse and midlife social support, does that tell us anything about people's long-term mortality risks? Essentially, it's a parallel question saying, you know, in the past, what we've asked about is, can high-quality early relationships offset early adversity? Now we're asking, can high-quality midlife relationships offset early adversity? And the evidence so far suggests they can. So these are the survival curves. So this here, these are survival curves for people who didn't report any severe physical abuse during childhood. This is the curve for people who reported physical abuse and had poor quality social relationships in midlife. And you can see that it's much more accelerated. And this is the curve for people who had early abuse but reported high support, high quality midlife relationships. They look basically like people who were not exposed to childhood abuse. Again, I wouldn't run with this to the bank because the findings are still being worked out and it's just one study. But it does suggest the potential that what happens later in life with your social relationships can potentially have some compensatory or offsetting effects for earlier experience, which I think, if substantiated, is really good news. Really good news. All right. So the relationship story is a good one. It's a good one. It's probably consistent with many of the intuitions people in the Bowen tradition would have about the values of focusing on families and relationships and how powerful of a force for good they can become. Now, the self-control story is a more complicated one. So I'm going to take a sip of water and have you guys take a deep breath for a second and just say, stick with me here. This story turns out to have more twists and turns than the relationship story. So there's a strong sense in the developmental psychopathology literature that self-control is an important protective factor for kids growing up in disadvantaged environments. And we, again, wanted to say, all right, if it's protective for academic outcomes and mental health outcomes, is it also protective for physical health? And we started this work after we'd done most of this work on caregiving and relationships and thought, all right, that worked out great. This is going to work out great too. So the first thing we did is go back to some of these studies that Gene Brody had done in rural Georgia. And in a first sort of analysis, what we did is looked at kids' psychosocial outcomes at age 19. These are symptoms of depression, substance use, externalizing behaviors, as a function of their family SES when they were ages 11 to 13, and their levels of self-control. And these are self-control levels as rated by parents and teachers across 3 years and averaged. And what we find is exactly what you'd expect to find based on older literature, which is that kids who had more self-control as rated by their parents and teachers at age 11 to 13, so pre-adolescence, looked better psychosocially when they were 19, right? This is not a big surprise. We are like the 180th people to find this. This is not, but that those relationships were most strong, again, for the kids from the most economically disadvantaged families. And again, we may not be the 180th to find that, but we're like the 80th to find that or something, right? That kids in disadvantaged families and schools and communities benefit more from high self-control than their more privileged peers, perhaps because they have fewer resources available in their schools and communities in the first place. But again, the main story here is not a surprising one. So then we said, all right, we can look at health at age 19. And in health here, we're looking at allostatic load. This is Bruce McEwen's concept. For those of you not familiar with it, it's a composite, in this case, of different indicators of cardiovascular risk. It's got waist circumference. It's got, that tells you about belly fat. It's got blood pressure. It's got inflammation. I think it's got blood glucose in it too. And here what we find is in the kids who are less disadvantaged. So remember, this entire sample is on the whole a fairly economically disadvantaged sample of rural kids. But there's variability within there for sure. So the less disadvantaged kids are ones where I would say that the family or household income tends to be somewhere between about 1.5 and 2 times the federal poverty line. So that would be somewhere between about $40,000 and $50,000 in today's dollars for a family of 4, where one of the parents has an associate's degree. That would be kind of our normative, less disadvantaged families. So in that group, lower self-control or better self-control, ages 11 to 13, forecasts lower allostatic load at age 19. So again, as you'd expect, self-control is protective. But then when you look at the more disadvantaged kids, and these are the ones where family income is below the federal poverty line, typically single caregiver household with a high school education or less, and things go exactly the opposite direction. For those kids, having more self-control at ages 11 to 13 forecasts more allostatic load at age 19. So it's not a protective factor in this group. In fact, it's just the opposite. It seems to be a vulnerability factor. So we scratched our heads for months and months about these findings because they went against the grain of everything we knew. First of all, the mental health outcomes that we looked at in those other slides suggest that regardless of your family economic context, self-control is protective over the long term. All the other literature suggests the same thing. But here in this subgroup, it's not only protective, it seems to be risk promoting. Really surprising. So then we went to another sample that Gene had studied over the years. They were a bit older. These were subjects in a different longitudinal study that picked up kids at about age 17 and followed them through about age 22. But also rural African Americans from small communities around Georgia. So we tried to replicate the findings. And in this case, what we're doing is creating 4 groups that vary on family socioeconomic status and the child's self-control, again, as rated by parents and teachers. And so you can imagine a 2-dimensional space, SES being one of the axes, self-control being the other. and people very simply being divided into 4 groups. So those with higher SES and high self-control, low SES, low self-control, and then the mixture groups. And what we're going to do is use those 4 groups between the ages of 17 and 19 and use them to tell us about people's psychosocial outcomes over that same period. And we're going to look here at, you can't see this, I apologize, but we've got substance use, depressive symptoms, internalizing problems, and aggressive behavior. And what these trajectories would show you, if I displayed them more clearly, was that what matters for all of these outcomes is not SES. What matters for these outcomes is self-control. That kids who have high levels of self-control, as rated by their parents or teachers, have less substance use, aggressive behavior, less depression, fewer internalizing symptoms as they move into adulthood. And that's true for both higher and lower income kids, but that self-control is really what trumps everything here during the transition to adulthood. Again, we're consistent with other research. This is not news, unsurprising. So then we said, all right, we saw that in the last study too. Now let's move to a physical health outcome. And in this particular study, we didn't have allostatic load measures. What we had is a measure of cellular aging. So many of you have probably heard about telomere studies. I don't know if they've been presented here before. We're not looking at telomeres here, but we're looking at something kind of close. We're using DNA methylation patterns, so epigenetics, to kind of gauge the age of cells. And I can talk about the details of that if anybody's interested, but for now, just let's leave it at that. We're looking at how fast people's cells have aged. And we see this same puzzling crossover interaction here, where for kids from less disadvantaged backgrounds, so these are the ones in blue, high self-control, ages 17 to 19, is associated with lower rates of cellular aging at age 22. For kids from more disadvantaged backgrounds, it's the opposite. More self-control, ages 17 to 19, the faster their cells have aged by the time they're 22. So again, different cohort, different outcome, same puzzling and crazy finding that things go in opposite directions for self-control depending on the family socioeconomic context. So we're really scratching our heads now because we initially thought that first study was just a fluke. We were finding something weird and that we weren't going to replicate it. But now we've got 2 studies, 2 cohorts. They show exactly the same thing. So we spend a lot of time talking to colleagues, thinking about what this means. And at some point, I run across a colleague in Chicago who says, oh, this makes perfect sense. What do you mean this makes perfect sense? She says, don't you know all the literature on differential returns to mobility and education by racial ethnic group in the US? And I said, oh yeah, I do know that. And she said, have you ever seen this graph? And she shows me this graph. So this is a very distressing graph that shows the differences in life expectancy between Black Americans and white Americans. And so the y-axis is just the number of years they differ in total life expectancy post age 25. And what most of us, I think, would have thought a priority is that the size of this gap between blacks and whites in life expectancy would be strongest for Americans who had the least education and the least opportunity, and that education, particularly a college education, would mitigate that difference, right? This is sort of one of the founding assumptions and sustaining myths of our society, right? That we can all pull ourselves up on the bootstraps, and that there's equal opportunity and that opportunity pays off, right? That's implicit in the whole American narrative. But what you see here is actually quite the opposite. That the biggest differences between blacks and whites in mortality are for college graduates. And the next biggest are for people with some college, an AA degree, right? So blacks and whites without a high school education have about a 3-year mortality difference favoring whites, whereas it's about 4.5 years at the college level. And she said, my colleague said, this makes perfect sense. Everybody knows that basically minorities in this country don't get the same return on their educational investments as whites do. And you can see that in wages. So if you look at Harvard graduated lawyers who are African Americans versus white Americans, they get paid very different levels across their career. If you look at doctors from Hopkins who are black versus white, they enter very different sorts of wage structures. This is a pervasive pattern. And I thought, gosh, you're right. That's exactly what seems to be going on here. We're looking at differences in return, and that self-control, as we're studying it, is really a proxy for kids who have high self-control being the ones that are moving on to get more education, to enter college and university settings and workplace settings where they're going to be a minority group, and they're moving out of communities where they have been for most of their life into communities that may not be as welcoming and may not provide the same returns that you would get as a majority group member entering into those groups. And we said, oh gosh, if that's what's going on, we should be able to see that in our data. And that would have really important clarifying and policy implications. So we went back and we said, okay, this is back to rural African American samples from Georgia. And here what we're going to do is we're just going to say, we're going to look at the neighborhood kids grew up in, and whether it had high versus low levels of neighborhood poverty based on census data as the kid was moving through adolescence. And then we're going to look at age 19, is the kid in college or not? Simply any kind of college. And then look at how that relates to allostatic load. And what we did when we saw that is what we found is, again, this same kind of crossover interaction. And this one is even more disturbing than we could have anticipated. So on this axis, you have percent neighborhood poverty during adolescence, right? So the higher you go on this graph, the more concentrated the poverty you grew up in, the lower, the less concentrated. On this axis, you have allostatic load, again, that composite of health problems related to cardiovascular disease. What you see is that if you grew up in a neighborhood with very low levels of poverty, being in college at age 19 is associated with really low levels of allostatic load, good health. And not being in college is associated with worse health. On the other hand, if you grew up in a neighborhood with high levels of poverty, it was the reverse. Being in college was associated in that case with much higher rates of health problems. Now, this is really confounding to people who believe, as most of us have historically, that education is good for health, right? That is a strong, strong finding and a strong, strong assumption that people who finish college enjoy many, many benefits of in our country, including, in general, more longevity and decreased risk for disease. But this is suggesting that's not true. That is not true for African Americans in the South, particularly those who grow up in highly concentrated neighborhood poverty. So again, we scratched our heads and we said, wow, this is very different than the narrative. It's very different from some of the existing literature. But then again, most of the existing literature hasn't really asked the questions in quite these ways, hasn't focused on racial and ethnic minority groups. Is this right? So we went then to a study called AdHealth. So this is a national study of adolescent health. It's run by Kathy Harris at UNC. And this study has about 12,000 respondents in it from across the United States, population representative. It has high numbers of African Americans and Latinos relative to other studies. And it's followed the kids from basically early adolescence until their mid-30s or so at this point. And we tried to look at whether we'd see similar patterns in AdHealth. And so what I'm going to be showing you is a couple of graphs that, in the first one, we're going to be looking at a psychosocial outcome. We're going to be looking at simple depressive symptoms by the CESD. And we're going to look at it as a function, again, of childhood disadvantage. This is a composite of disadvantage at the individual level, at the family level, at the neighborhood level. AdHealth's really rich in this. And then whether people ever got a college degree. And this would be a 4-year college degree in this case, not a 2-year college degree. And we're looking at depressive symptoms between the ages of 24 and 32. And as you can see, there are a lot of people in this sample. This is over 13,000 respondents. And what you see in this graph is that regardless of whether you're looking at non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks, or Hispanics, college education is good for your mental health. There's no question about it, that in all three racial ethnic groups, having a college education is associated with lower levels of depressive symptoms in early adulthood. And it's also the case that more childhood adversity is related to more depressive symptoms in early adulthood, not a surprise. But the punchline here is that college is good for your mental health, regardless of who you are. So then we said, okay, we've seen this story before. Does physical health go along with mental health? And we looked at metabolic syndrome risk. So same sort of analyses. Again, metabolic syndrome prevalence between the ages of 24 and 32 as a function of childhood disadvantage and whether or not you have a college degree. About 11,000 respondents in this analysis. And again, the same crazy pattern, disturbing pattern in racial and ethnic minority participants. So in white subjects, basically no college degree, you see higher rates of metabolic syndrome than people with a college degree. Pretty consistent. In African Americans and Latinos, having a college degree is beneficial for your health if you come from a family in a neighborhood with low levels of disadvantage. On the other hand, if you're a racial or ethnic minority in this sample and you come from a disadvantaged family or neighborhood, going to college is associated with worse metabolic health when you hit your mid-20s to early 30s. So again, big sample, we can be much more confident. It's not just the rural South here. We're using a population representative study from across the United States. And I think in pretty dramatic fashion showing that this pattern that we identified in African Americans in the rural South also extends to Latinos across the United States, but you don't see it for whites. So the punchline here is that the bootstraps argument, the idea that if we just work hard and go to school and play by the rules, we're going to all enjoy equivalent benefits, isn't at all borne out by this data. The idea that what we need is more grit and more self-control is also not borne out by this data. It suggests that that grit and self-control, while beneficial for mental health, and almost certainly beneficial for getting through college, for earning more money, for having positive outcomes in those life domains, I'm not disputing that at all, has some costs for physical health. But those costs are borne entirely by African Americans and Latinos, and not by whites. So the idea that we can reduce this all to a simple narrative about we all need more grit, we all need to work harder, and everything's going to work out okay, the data tell a very different story here for certain groups in our society. So what's this all about? And this is the most undeveloped part of the talk, because we really have identified these patterns, but don't have a clear sense at all of what explains them and what's going on. And we have sort of two baskets of explanations that we're trying to test right now in studies, which, why is it that upward mobility, that working hard, striving, having high levels of perseverance, getting education could be bad for health of ethnic minority groups in the United States from high levels of disadvantage? And our explanations are both about what we call the costs of striving, so what it takes to succeed if you come from a disadvantaged background and you're a racial or ethnic minority in the United States. It could be about what Sherman James, the sociologist, calls John Henryism, this idea that you have to have constant, hard driving work to get there, that, as he says, the mountain is just so much steeper. The deck is stacked against you, and you have to work 4 times as hard as your more privileged white peers to get to the same place. And it's that effort, that constant effort that it takes to succeed, that takes the toll on health. There are other explanations too. It might be that some of these constant hard driving efforts and this perseverance that it takes leaves limited time and opportunity for exercise, for healthy diets, for social relationships, for the kinds of things you need to maintain good cardiometabolic health into midlife. It could be that kids from disadvantaged backgrounds and racial and ethnic minority groups find themselves caught in a situation where they have competing demands and obligations to their peers in their college and university environment and their workplace, and their families, who may not have gone to college, may not have been in professional circles, and that there are challenges in balancing and negotiating the different demands of those social roles, and balancing and negotiating the different identities one has, and that those competing strains from kind of different environments are what undermine health. These are all possibilities. We don't have data on this. There's also another set of explanations that aren't so much about the process of getting there, what we call costs of striving, but that might be costs of arriving. That one of the things we find in talking to kids from the studies in rural Georgia is that they feel, the ones who go to college, which is about half of them in the latest sample, express this tremendous sense of support that they've received from their families, from their communities, from their towns. And when they leave those settings to move to college and move to the workplace, they find that they lose some of those support structures, and they find themselves in environments where their peers aren't so supportive, where they feel quite different in terms of background, in terms of culture, in terms of racial and ethnic identity than the peers they more frequently encounter. So I could tell you multiple anecdotes about rural Southern African Americans who went to law school and said, look, I was one of 2 African Americans in my law school class of 200, and it only got worse when I actually got a job in a law firm. And feeling like they don't quite belong in the educational and occupational settings where they find themselves, and that though they have strived and they have arrived, that it's not quite what it's cracked up to be. They feel like a stranger in their new world, but they also at the same time feel like a stranger potentially in their family of origin and their community of origin, and that enemy people report being very challenging. There are also massive differences in wealth. So again, I alluded to this before, just because somebody goes to law school or medical school, gets their degree and goes into a job, doesn't mean that they automatically have the same resources that a peer who came from a more privileged circumstance did. So we've talked to lots of subjects who have said, yeah, I went to law school. I thought I was going to be able to go and buy a nice home in a good suburban school district and buy a car. But between my loans and the money that I send back to help take care of my family who doesn't have resources, I don't have the money to do that. Everybody else in my firm who has the same starting salary is able to do that because their parents and grandparents set aside money to make a down payment on their first house and for their kids' college education. So arriving means very different things depending on where you started. There are clearly issues of alienation and discrimination that many members of racial and ethnic minority groups face, even in universities and workplace settings that are theoretically progressive places. All these explanations, again, are hypotheses. We've got a couple of ongoing studies where we're trying to really follow people as they make their journeys and understand what's happening here and what's at stake. In the meantime, we've tried to write about this and change the narrative a little bit. So as I was encouraging you all to get involved and talk to your local politicians, op-eds are another effective way to do this. Writing to your local paper is a really good idea. This is an opinion piece we wrote for the Times a few years ago, where we titled it provocatively, "Can Upward Mobility Cost You Your Health?" And this sort of outlined some of our findings and tried to get people to think in a more nuanced way. We actually got Rush Limbaugh very mad, which I thought was quite an achievement. We're very proud of ourselves, but he went on like a 20-minute rant on one of his radio shows about how stupid this research was and how, we must have been funded by some communist liberal pinko outfit and why anybody would bother doing this. But it was really interesting. So he went on this long rant, which you'd kind of expect for somebody as dysregulated as he is, about how stupid this was and, President Obama, blah, 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 conspiracy. And then all of a sudden, he does a 180-degree turn. I mean, a pivot like you never see. And he says, of course upward mobility has costs. Of course it's hard. He's like, why do you, and he basically said, why do you think I've had so many problems with my weight and with drug use and with my relationships? Because getting to the top when you come from the bottom is almost impossible. You have to claw your way to the top. It's miserable. And he basically just spent the next 10 minutes proving our point with his own personal narrative. It's very interesting how that could happen. But that's about all now. With that, so this is work that has all been very collaborative. I'm really fortunate to have great colleagues from a variety of disciplines who deserve all the credit and none of the blame, as they say, and a fantastic group of students, both undergraduates and graduate students and postdocs, who have made all this work possible. So I thank you for your indulgence, and I'm happy to answer some questions if you have them. You gotta break the rules and drink some water, though.
Hi, I was, go ahead, Phil.
I had a question. In exploring your hypotheses about the physical outcome, they're all related, I thought, to the nature of what might be the stressors that are going on. But I would think what's even more interesting to me is why it would be in the physical realm and not the depression realm, because all of those hypotheses would also be supportive of greater rates of depression, but you don't have depression. And so it makes me wonder, what is it about physical health? Of course, my mind goes to family factors, but anyway.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we had assumed, as had most of our colleagues for years, that these things would go together, that good mental health and good physical health are kind of one and the same, or closely enough related, and that they shouldn't diverge. And that's part of why these findings, I think, were such a shock to our system, is that they were one of the first examples that things could go in different directions. As it turns out, as we read more and more and talk to more and more colleagues, we're not the first ones to find this pattern. There are a lot of scattered findings. So James Jackson, who's a social psychologist at the University of Michigan, has done really beautiful studies of midlife and later life African Americans, and found that very similar patterns, inverse correlations between depressive symptoms and heart disease risk factor. His argument, which again is something that he and others are studying intensively, is that, and a lot of his studies have been in urban settings, that the strategies that and he focuses mainly on African American males, but the strategies that African American males have to use to cope with the pressures and stressors from our society, that they're effective in promoting good mental health and preventing depressive symptoms, but that they're bad for physical health. So his argument is that patterns related to diet and substance use and alcohol use, particularly in mid and later life, might provide some relief psychosocially from these stressors, but have a physical health effect. That's one of his hypotheses. So there's a way that things could go in divergent directions.
Yeah, that's counter to most research, isn't it? That because physical and emotional symptoms usually are fairly correlated.
Yeah, I mean, the assumption has been that they are, but they're fairly correlated at the extremes. And the question is, at the broader population level, when you don't just focus on samples of people who are already pretty sick in a tertiary care setting, are they correlated?
Yeah.
So it might be that you get end-of-life cancer patients or heart disease patients who are very sick, and then they tend to go hand in hand. The question is, earlier in the life course when people aren't so frankly ill.
Okay.
I had a question about this, the studies that you followed up on in Georgia. So you had initially started talking about the kids, the project having supportive caregivers. Mm-hmm. And then I thought I heard you say that the intervention was then with parents. Was that true?
Yeah, the intervention.
So not teachers or mentors, but just parents.
Parents I would say that about 2/3 of the caregivers in those studies were parents, and about 1/3 were grandparents or aunts and uncles.
Okay, so not the teachers, the nurturing teachers or supportive mentors?
No, that intervention. And to my knowledge, and you can correct me, please, if there are, that most of the intervention studies in this area based on families have focused on parents and grandparents.
Yeah, which I think is interesting because from the Bowen perspective, it would be a different piece to have family members, primarily parents or grandparents, aunts and uncles, in an emotional leadership role for kids to have, and for that to have an impact on children's lives versus teachers, mentors.
Yeah.
That piece would be very separate as far as I think most Bowen people would see.
Yeah, and I think most folks working in the field would say that, if you could work with families, that would be, your most likely point of leverage for kids, especially younger kids, maybe moving into adolescence, if you could work with other mentors, teachers, other folks in their lives, adults in their lives, but that, given the current social structure of our society, that those families are, oftentimes have limited availability and bandwidth for those interventions and are, working hard just to keep a roof over their head. And so you might need to have alternative points of contact to really reach the kids who are most at risk. But nobody knows. It's a study waiting to be done.
There is a factor I want to ask you about that I would include as a buffer protective factor, which is the number of family members with whom the baby, child, adult, and his or her parents have contact with, the number of family members with whom there is contact. And the evidence that I would have is anecdotal in many ways, but it's a relatively easy fact to get in an interview. How many family members did you have contact with in the last month, in the last year? But what I found in Texas, where there are so many families from all over the world moving in to live and work, that the contact with family is easily interrupted. And my guess is that those families where there's less contact will have more physical symptoms and more challenges at any socioeconomic level. And do you know if any of you or your I think Sheldon Cohen gets at some of this, looking at the response to viruses.
Yeah.
Any other indicators of that or evidence for that you all are looking at?
There's I think good evidence on what Sheldon Cohen would call social network diversity, right? So the idea that people have multiple social roles that might involve being a parent, a sibling, a spouse, a volunteer in a community organization, a member of a religious organization, and that the diversity and number of those roles is protective against health problems. I think that's kind of the closest. I don't think anybody that I know of is really focused on number of family members in the way that you're describing.
I think that if people did, it would filter out as trumping community organizations, church, and social, but it would warrant study.
Yeah, it's definitely a question that needs to be asked.
Other questions, but I'm going to defer. There are other brains on this line.
Dr. Miller, I have a question, and then I want to offer a possible interpretation coming out of Bowen theory for this divergence you've presented at the end. The question is, when the researchers look at self-control, is there variation in how people exert self-control, self-regulation?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer is absolutely, but it's not well captured in our measures.
Okay. Is that about as much as you can say? Or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we all we all recognize that our measures fall short of capturing the complexity of anything, psychological, so the complexity of relationships, the complexity of social interactions, or certainly the complexity of ways that people try to chart their path towards long-term goals. And some people go out and try to shake up the world and change the environment and have the wrecking ball approach, and other people go about it quietly by changing themselves or changing their goals or changing the value they assign to particular steps of the goal. And if I guessing at where you're going, I think that those two approaches are potentially very different ways of getting the same thing that might have different consequences for where you end up health-wise. Right. But we don't really capture that in our studies very effectively.
Okay, my sort of tentative offering then in terms of Bowen theory would be that the theory notes, and it seems borne out in clinical practice, that chronic anxiety in a family can be absorbed in different ways. Conflict, but also in terms of internalization of anxiety by particular members of the family. And that can come out in forms of behavior problems, in terms of sort of aggressive, unregulated behavior. It can come out in emotional ways, depression and other psychiatric symptoms, but it also can get expressed physically in terms of affecting one's physiological health and longevity. So I just wonder if there's something about the way in which folks from low socioeconomic status groups who go on to achieve educationally and in terms of income may bind their chronic anxiety more in terms of physical symptom expression than in terms of behavior acting out or in terms of psychiatric emotional issues, and that might account in part for this skew that you're observing.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like that's the pattern that we're showing. I think the question is just, how we would capture that, how you would measure that, and how you would empirically measure that binding of anxiety. But if you've got ideas,
It's a what?
well, if you've got ideas about how to approach that from a measurement perspective, it'd be fascinating to incorporate.
I'd like to talk more about that with you.
I think, I had a comment too, but unfortunately we are at lunchtime and I think this conversation will go on for the 2 days. So thank you for your presentation.